stewards of the land, it was always because of that, the inherent rights that they had to be able to live off the land. So in return, they had a real role and a responsibility to care for the land. And so when we think about the idea of treaties and how our Indigenous treaty partners went into this sacred agreement, it was because it was something that was not uncommon to them. Intertribal treaties had been happening for, since time immemorial on what we call Turtle Island. And the reason why we had these pre-contact treaties, these intertribal treaties, is so that we could share the land with each other, so that we could have access to hunting and fishing, gathering purposes for food and medicinal and ceremonial purposes, and being able to work together to maintain the ecology. We wanted to make sure that resources were kept intact and that we were always thinking about how we were going to provide for those future generations. And you think about the diversity, right? There's 11 numbered treaties, there's pre-contact treaties, and we've got modern day agreements. And you think about how each treaty that was negotiated with certain nations, specific nations. For example, in my territories where I come from, Treaty 6 territory negotiated with the Cree Nation. And of course, certain protocols and procedures would be in place because it's a Cree Nation. And that would be different too, according to what territory you're in. And so, for example, in where I live in the province of Saskatchewan, there would be several different protocols that we would adhere to working with, right? Negotiating treaty with. So those protocols that were taking place between, for example, an intertribal treaty between Cree people and Saulteaux people, and exchanging procedures with each other. We would have been sharing our own understandings of laws, and inherent rights. So when you think about that with these Indigenous nations and the diversity of them and having intertribal treaties for thousands of years, when it came time to negotiate, our numbered treaties, specifically Treaty 6 with the British Crown, they were very well versed in how to negotiate treaties. And they were always about the protection of nations. It was always about maintaining the land. It was always about providing a livelihood and being able to provide for those future generations. You had to make sure that when you had these intertribal treaties, you were honoring the protocols of that land and of that territory. So for example, as a Cree person who is following the migration of, for example, say moose or the bison, you would have to make sure that as you're approaching a territory that belongs to, say, Saulteaux or Dakota people, you have a treaty in place so that when you're accessing that land, that you're not encroaching on another tribe's access to their livelihood. And so that was always the concept of a treaty, was to be able to share the land in a good way and to be able to maintain nations, and for those nations to be able to maintain their livelihood and their subsistence practices as they always had. And so when we think about, these intertribal treaties, they were spanning far, in a far larger territory than what we now call Canada. And so for Indigenous nations, these intertribal treaties were happening right across the turtle, all the way down to the turtle's tail. So for Indigenous people, we see, Native Americans and the Indigenous people in Mexico as our kin. We all come from the same creation story. We were all placed here on Turtle Island as caretakers of the land, and our creation stories identify us as those that keep the element of earth. And so when you look at how vast that is and how unique, that these treaties were, that they could connect individuals from all the way to the turtle's tail, all the way up onto what we would see as the east coast of Canada. And it often gets overlooked. The concept of treaties gets seen as only when contact was made. And, our pre-contact treaties, our peace and friendship treaties are, we don't think about what took place before. How did Indigenous people maintain the ecology? How did Indigenous people have trade with each other? It was through those intertribal treaties and those sacred agreements. And so when you look at the recordings of, for example, maize, which is corn, in the modern, I guess, context of recording, for example, for Indigenous people, things are oral history. So, our stories can be dated back thousands of years. But in terms of written recording, written records, maize, it was first seen on growing in and around the St. Lawrence River by Huron people as far back as 1615. So this is when European settlers were first, coming into those territories. They were seeing Huron people growing corn. This was in 1615. So when you look at the history of corn in modern, records, they date the maize back to 10,000 BC growing in Mexico, right? Well, how did maize get to the St. Lawrence River by 1615 before European settlement? It's because Indigenous people had intertribal treaties with each other, and they had trade agreements with each other. So they were trading seeds and they were trading goods. And that's important to recognize that, because for so long, the concept of a treaty has always been brought forward as just offered to Indigenous people from European nations, where the idea of a treaty was already there. It was a sacred agreement, an intertribal agreement that Indigenous nations had already been doing for thousands of years. So it's always important to understand that, because why this was taking place was, the being those stewards of the land, but also recognizing that, as humanity, as human beings, they had inherent laws to live by, and these were laws given to them by Creator through creation. And they were laws that made sure that they took care of the land, made sure that they provided for 7 generations ahead, which is something that Indigenous people often refer to as, we have to think about what's to come in 7 generations. What do we leave for them? We have to acknowledge that there are future generations to come, and the work we do now and the impact we make now could either be positive or negative for those future generations. So it was always important that these intertribal treaties that happened between different Indigenous nations were always rooted on those laws of that land and that territory, based on that nation, whether they were Cree or Dene or Saulteaux, Nakota, that they had those laws based on the language of that territory, and recognizing rights and responsibilities. You have a right to drink water, you have a right to water, but you have a responsibility to keep water safe and clean. And you have a responsibility to ensure there's water for future generations. We have a right to grow crops from the land, to provide our livelihood and feed our families, but we have a responsibility to make sure that the land is safe, that the land can continue to harvest goods to us. So there's these rights and responsibilities we had. We're an inherent right to access, the land, but an inherent responsibility to make sure that the land is always safe and there for future generations. And that was always the basis of these intertribal treaties. And that was why Indigenous people, when they went into these agreements with the British Crown, had all of this prior understanding, and had come there with the idea of protection of the land and protection of their nations. It's important to also acknowledge the 7 sacred laws. And while the laws are developed mainly by Anishinaabe people, through intertribal treaties, we share those laws with each other, those 7 sacred laws. And it's important to understand those when it comes to the treaty relationship, and understanding, that treaty identity. Because when we live with these laws in our life, it helps to guide us and helps us to have a good life. We must respect each other. We must love each other. We must have courage to be able to show that type of treatment to each other. We have to be honest, because sometimes it's hard to be a human being. We have to be vulnerable, but we also have to have wisdom about that life that we live, and honor that. we also have to have humility and be humble, recognizing that as a human being, we are, one of, the beings that are the most reliant on the elements and on the rest of creation, and have truth and be truthful to the reality of what it is that we live in, the society we live in, the place that we live in, and the life that we live. When we're living a life by honoring those 7 sacred laws, then we're doing something that recognizes the protocols of these land, that is how Indigenous people always went forward each day, was recognizing those 7 sacred laws, so that they were treating their kin in a good way, that they were honoring the land and respecting all of creation. And so I want to share this quote. Sorry, I went forward. I want to share this quote from the late Danny Musco, he's a Saulteaux elder from Treaty 4 territory. I had the privilege of working alongside him when I was in university, and in a former role I had within a different organization. And I really like what he says here, because he's speaking about Indigenous worldview. And he talks about, how as Indigenous people, they have a holistic view of the universe, and everything is seen as circular, And so he says we need the old and the young, the old to teach and the young to keep the traditions alive, and that nothing really dies out in a circle. Things might get old and wear away, but they renew again generation after generation. This is what the circle is about. And I share this with you because it's important when understanding this worldview of Indigenous people. It's important to understand this quote in terms of thinking about that treaty relationship. For many of us, we grew up not knowing that there was a relationship between treaty partners that needed to be fostered. Many of us grew up not knowing we had a treaty identity and a role and a responsibility associated. You see, because for many generations, that relationship, was getting old. It felt like it was wearing away, but as late Elder Danny says, things renew again, generation after generation. And that's important because here we are in a space talking about our treaty identity, and understanding that we have roles and responsibilities. And I think that's, that renewing again, that's starting to come into place. So when we look at, the geographics of Treaties 1 to 11, it's such a large territory of land in what we call Canada, right? And when you think about it, through those treaties, the idea was land sharing. And you see how large those territories are that belonged, to Indigenous nations. And for them to only be now occupying 2% of that land base is really alarming. And that's due to not because of the treaties, but a breach of treaty, which we're going to talk about a bit later. But when you look at that land base, you have to recognize that within each of those treaty territories is Indigenous nations and their traditional territories that they've been caring for since the beginning of time. And so when we think about that, the importance of, land base, it's such a large stretch of land. And you have to understand that the idea of, sharing the land and preserving it for future generations is always first and foremost important and something to think about. Because when we look at it, we see that it's such a large piece of land being cared for, taken care of. But now only 2% of that entire land base is being allowed to be protected by Indigenous nations, because that 2% is where the reservations fall into. And so you think about it, it's really unfortunate because Indigenous people, that's their purpose. That's why Creator brought them to Turtle Island, right? To maintain the land, but suddenly they're only having access to 2% of it. How does that impact the rest of us living in Canada, right? So at the bottom there, you'll see where I write, nations make treaties, treaties don't make nations. That's really important to remember, that this treaty did not create a nation. There was already 2 nations that came together, which was the British Crown, which was, the dominion over Canada, the authority over Canada. signed these treaties with Indigenous nations. So what that was recognizing is that Indigenous nations were their own sovereign nations with their own governments and their own laws. And so what's important to understand too is because this treaty was negotiated between the British Crown and Indigenous nations here, it became an international treaty and is international law. And so it's often, overlooked that and often seen that the treaty created the nations of Cree territory or Soto, but they were already their own sovereign nations. And by creating a treaty that's honoring and recognizing that, and that's always really important because that's something that Indigenous people are always striving for, is to assert their sovereignty. Because of a breach of treaty, we're living under the Indian Act, which doesn't give us, a lot of access to our traditional governance systems and our laws. And these treaties are often seen as a contract, a written agreement only, but they're much more than that. They're sacred agreements that were to provide a reciprocal relationship between treaty partners where there would be mutual benefit, mutual respect, where each treaty partner would maintain their livelihood as they had prior to that treaty. So as Indigenous people were living, they were sharing the land with each other, intertribally, and they were migrating with the seasons and the animals, and they were speaking their languages, and they were practicing their ceremonial life and their subsistence as they always had been. And that was what they had agreed to in these negotiations, is that it would be an undisrupted way of life, and that we would honor that the same way for the settler community that comes. They would have an undisrupted way of life. They will get to maintain their livelihood as they had, and maintain their languages, maintain their culture. And together we'll come and we'll share the land. But we'll also create a synthesis of our two worldviews, understanding that, by bringing in together two nations, they could bring forward the best parts of each other's worldview and culture and create a new way forward. And so that's what those treaty negotiations were about, right? You wanted a reciprocal relationship between each other where we mutually respect each other and we ensure that no treaty partner is benefiting more than the other. And that was what those negotiations and agreements, what was first and foremost the important thing brought to the table by Indigenous community was, that they wanted to just maintain their culture and their existence as they always had. And they wanted that for their treaty partner too. And so it was, an understanding of, just honoring each other and respecting each other, because the land is how we provide a living. But of course, too, wanted to also make sure, those resources were maintained for future generations. And, when we think about the reasonings behind a treaty, it's different for both treaty partners. Each treaty partner had their own reasoning for going into a treaty, and at the time had their own worldview. And that's really important to understanding, the perspectives of treaty and how things played out to what we now have contemporary. And so the only reason that a treaty was so important for the British Crown and for Canadian settlement was because of the Royal Proclamation of 1763, where, it was stated that you could not occupy these territories unless you had an agreement with the Indigenous people that were already residing there. So, it was a British king that had declared this. And so when you think about it, it was based on law why that treaty came into effect for the British Crown, for our treaty partners. But for Indigenous community, they wanted their nations to survive. They understood that they didn't have access to the buffalo like they always had. They weren't able to access, traditional hunting territories as they typically had because there was settlement taking place there. So there was a lot of encroachment on each other's territories taking place. And so they understood, well, settler community will continue to come and make a livelihood here. So we have to have, in agreement with them, like we've always done intertribally, we now need to do this with the settler community. And of course, for, you know, um, the British Crown, it was more, well, we're going to help Canada to secure the border, from the US. And of course, to try and prevent, expensive, and costly wars and costly expansion. The treaty was always, has a different perspective on either side. And that's always important to understand because, that relationship, is, for many decades wasn't there, it wasn't being fostered or nurtured. And I think many reasons, of course, is the Indian Act, but also that there was, a different perspective for both sides, for both treaty partners. They had very different reasonings for going into this treaty without really any sort of way of understanding that about each other. As this negotiation is happening, there's nobody that's kind of nonpartisan to them, making sure that they're both acknowledging the fact that they're both going into this agreement for very different reasons, right? For the, newcomer settler community, they want to access the land, they want to develop it, they want to have prosperity and wealth because many of them are coming from their own persecution in their own, home countries. They're coming from war-torn, communities. So they're coming here looking for a new way. And for the British Crown, they want to, help support Canada in a minimal cost for establishing themselves as a nation. And they don't want to go into war with Indigenous community, and they don't want to go to war, with America. Want to protect that border and secure it. But for Indigenous people, it's first and foremost just a physical survival of their nations. And first and foremost, they just want to be able to access the land as they always had and maintain their livelihood. And they want to have, as they had always had with their intertribal treaties, was peaceful relations with each other, And of course, because of the overhunting of the buffalo, and the inability to access, traditional hunting territories, they also needed treaty provisions, right? They needed to be provided with agricultural benefits and things to help them. They wanted to be able to have access and be taught how to utilize the new technologies that were coming over with settler community, because they understood that there would be, a new way of life going forward. That they would have to transition to a new way of life, because as they had hoped during those treaty negotiations is that there would be this synthesis of their two worldviews, that they would take the best parts of each other's cultures and livelihoods and fuse them in together into a way moving forward. So, Indigenous people would have hoped that, the inherent laws that apply to the land as being stewards of the land would have maintained themselves too in those treaties. Worldview too, that's another thing. The very different perspectives of, community and family. So the way this is interpreted is not to be for present day. What it is a worldview of how things would have been during treaty negotiations. So while, for settler community, they may, in this current time, not identify with that worldview. And so when I share this, I don't share this with the idea that settler community has this worldview now. It's important to share it because it helps us to understand the worldview at the time of treaty negotiations, because that's what impacted the relationship down the line. Because as you can see, there's differences, right? For Indigenous people, everything was very communal, that the entire tribe shared everything, and work that was done within the tribe was for the benefit of the entire tribe. Where when settlement was taking place, it was more individualism, and it was all personal ownership and prosperity, and, for their own immediate family, the nuclear family, right? Whereas within Indigenous tribes, the family was the entire tribe, extended relatives, right? And, it was often at that time, in Indigenous tribes, the elderly, particularly the women, were held in really high regard, and they were an immense source of wisdom and were one of the highest levels of governance. Where on the other end, it was often seen as it was a deterrence. The more you aged, you became reliant on the younger generations, and that was, almost, not valued. So there was a lot of differences that were happening in terms of worldview at the time of these treaty negotiations that really impacted the way the relationship moved forward. And when these treaties were negotiated, they weren't like modern contracts where sometimes it can happen in a day or, a week, a month. For Treaty 6, it was over 2 years of negotiating to get to a place where they felt comfortable agreeing and signing the treaty. As Treaty 4 was wrapping up in 1874, it was already when the negotiations began for Treaty 6, because Treaty 6 chiefs within the province of Saskatchewan and the province of Alberta were sending their leaders to Treaty 4 negotiations so that they could have an understanding of what was taking place, so that when it was their turn to have a treaty, they already knew what was being negotiated. They already knew the lingo and the language of what was happening with the British Crown. They already knew who was coming there, in terms of officials, because for Indigenous people, they sent their leaders and they sent their spiritualists, their medicine men, the grandmother societies, where the British Crown came there with, government officials and, lawyers and representatives of the church. So they had very different representatives there. A lot of the representation from Indigenous community came from, spiritual leaders, because during these negotiations, ceremony was at the first and foremost of everything. And Indigenous people were, open enough to sharing, their sacred prayers and ceremonies with the British Crown and their representatives, because that's how they had always done treaties intertribally. They had always been doing this type of agreement in a sacred ceremonial way with the creator, God present. And so these treaties that were being negotiated were processes that happened over years and months. And you had entire tribes camped outside of these where the negotiations took place. In my territory and for my leader, Beardy's, Treaty 6 was negotiated at this site here, where in the photo, which is Fort Carlton. And so you think about it, you would have had thousands of Indigenous people camped out outside of Fort Carlton. You would have had, hundreds of teepees. Tribes would have moved their entire community to that space during the negotiations. And each evening, after they've deliberated all day with the British Crown, then they would come back to their teepee camps, and they would meet with the grandmother societies. Because in those communities, the Kukums, which is Cree for grandmother, they were the highest level of governance. Because that the idea within Indigenous community is that, women are held in high regard because they are life givers, and because they are the ones that continue to nurture life into humanity. So the idea of, the negotiation of a treaty, it was much more than just, the signing of a contract, right? It was a very sacred covenant between two nations, where ceremony and creator was brought into that space. Sorry. In those negotiations, specifically for Treaty 6, there was certain things that were added in to Treaty 6 that weren't in other prior treaties. And so through these successful negotiations of Treaty 6, they then were applied to all treaties 1 to 11. But, currently, like you'll often hear a lot of and see on social media that there's a lot of tribes, nations within Treaty 6 that are currently having, an agricultural settlement claim, with the Canadian government right now, because terms of treaty that were negotiated have never been fulfilled, which is, the 2 hoes, 1 spade, 1 scythe for each farming family, the plow, harrows, there was, supposed to be cows and, you know, all these implements that were given, they were never offered to those nations. So currently what's happening for many nations is that they have a court claim right now with the federal government to be able to get settlement for their agricultural benefits, because that was a negotiation of treaty. That was a term, is that agricultural support, but many communities did not get anything. And we also have in Treaty 6 that was successfully negotiated and applied to all other the treaties was the medicine chest clause and the famine and pestilence assistance. And so the medicine chest clause was to be healthcare. And it's often been interpreted that it was free healthcare for just Indigenous people. And that was not the case. The medicine chest clause was the asking of healthcare for the people, for both treaty partners, because they understood as Indigenous people that there was a lot of foreign diseases coming in to their communities through settlement. So what they wanted the government to do was to provide medical care to the people, to the treaty people, so that they could always be able to maintain themselves for future generations, to be able to ensure that future generations wouldn't have health problems. So what it instead came to be was, the medicine chest clause was, a medicine chest kept by the Indian agent for the use of Indigenous people. But because treaties are meant to be a living document that evolves with time, the idea, now is that Indigenous people, we have free healthcare, which we don't. A lot of our healthcare comes through provincial insurance. But the idea was to be able to ensure treaty people had access to medical care. And I'm not sure how it is in the province of Alberta, but in the province of Saskatchewan, our healthcare system is failing us. And it's important to acknowledge that it was Indigenous treaty partners that wanted us to have healthcare. They included that in Treaty 6, and the famine and pestilence assistance, which is when they had asked that if should we ever be in a position where disease is overpowering us or we don't have access to food, that the government takes care of the treaty people. And so during COVID in the city I live in Saskatoon, one of the Treaty 6 bands was able to push the Canadian government to honor the famine and pestilence assistance. And we opened up at our sporting center a vaccine clinic, and it was for everyone. You didn't have to be First Nations or Métis or status. It was for everyone and anyone, because that was what the terms of treaty were about. We want to provide for everyone. Both treaty partners should have mutual benefit. And that also meant having access to healthcare during disease or support, during, for example, when COVID was prevalent in our communities, right? And we were able to access this term of treaty, and it applied to everyone. And it's important to understand those terms, because often many of the terms, especially the medicine chest clause, famine and pestilence, often gets interpreted as Indigenous community wanting free healthcare or wanting everything free. But what it was we wanted both treaty partners to be able to have that mutual benefit of having healthcare and support in time of need. When we talk about that relationship of treaty, it's important that we focus on where that comes from, right? And that comes from what we often refer to as the spirit and the intent of treaties. And that's the parts of treaty that you can't see or read, it's those parts of treaty that are sacred. Thinking of, for example, the pipe ceremonies that would have taken place and the sacred prayers that would have been spoken and those songs with the drum that would have been shared in those spaces. Those are the sacred parts of the treaty, the parts that we can't write about, the parts that we can't see and we can't hold. It's not written anywhere, but we know it. We feel it in our hearts. We remember it, that it was those sacredness, the ceremonies that took place, the vulnerability that Indigenous community must have felt bringing in their most sacred items, because they knew we need to have a good relationship here. And that's the other part about the spirit and intent, is that relationship of reciprocity, that we were both going to be, prospering together. We were both going to maintain our livelihood as we had. We were both going to have mutual benefit, and we were both going to respect each other mutually. That relationship with each other had to be something that was equitable and provided for both. And the continual fulfillment, with that sacredness of ceremony being brought there. Ceremony needed to happen every year. It needed to be happening between treaty partners, because ceremony is what established that treaty and was a first and foremost an important part of negotiations. In order for that relationship to be strong, you had to be able to have ceremony annually. And that's something that doesn't take place very often. Sometimes in some communities, when they do have a treaty day, they will invite representatives from the Canadian government to come. And sometimes they do have individuals that participate in those ceremonies. But that's what spirit and intent was honoring and understanding, the sacred parts of treaty, the ceremony, the prayers, the songs, that relationship we have with each other, where we both need to be benefiting. We both need to have a livelihood. One treaty partner shouldn't advance over the other, and continually honoring that relationship yearly by meeting together and having ceremony together. Because often treaty will get viewed as just, a written text, the article of treaty, which often is a framed document, which will be in, government offices, and which is the British Crown's interpretation of the treaty. But when you think about Indigenous people and how we interpret the treaty, there's so much more to that. Those natural inherent laws, that I spoke about earlier, where we have rights and responsibilities to maintaining the land, understanding that Indigenous people do have their own oral traditions pertaining to which territory you're in and which language group. They'll have their own, protocols and procedures for how they manage the land. And when we understand that each territory has a territory song, right? And in that song is the story of how that negotiation took place. And then the specific prayers and ceremonies that happened at treaty and are now utilized in each community annually when they have their treaty day. That's all important to understanding, what happened during treaty negotiations and how that relationship was supposed to carry forward. And often too, I find that reading journals from settler community is also important, because a lot of government documents, for example, the sessional papers or the treaty commissioner's publication, often highlight, systemic racism. But when you read the settler journals, that's not often the case. There's a very different perspective there, and that's important too, because that it helps us to understand what the treaty relationship was meant to be and what it can be. Because there's often times where government officials were denying rations to the Indigenous nations. But then you had individuals from settler community who owned stores. And, in the 1800s, it was very common practice to have a journal, a log of every day, what took place in the store. So what was happening in some of these journals is you were finding that some of the settler community was helping Indigenous community when they weren't getting rations, providing them, doing a barter with them or a trade. And so that stuff is important because it shows that there was a good relationship in certain spaces between Indigenous community and settler community, and we have to find those stories and highlight those, because that's how we move forward in a good way. If our ancestors could do it back then, we can do it now in present day, right? So it's always important, like when understanding treaties, to look farther than that written text, that article of treaty, to dig deeper into those spaces of what does it mean, right? Because treaties often looked at as a contract, but it's a concept. It's a way of life. It's a relationship you have with yourself, with others, and with the land. And see, this is that article of treaty that will often be placed in government buildings. And, often when I was, in school myself, we had this up on the school wall. So that was all I ever, as a child, grew up seeing, was like treaty was just this paper, right? But I'm fortunate in my life and what I've and being blessed to work alongside elders and knowledge keepers that promote treaty, I was able to get a different perspective. And that's the perspective that I'm always open and willing to share in spaces, because I think it's really important for everyone to understand, that identity, and that it's, always about, honoring the land. That was the biggest part of the treaties, was to make sure that the land was honored. When Treaty 6 was negotiated, they had specifically requested that it would only be the depth of a plow. 6 inches of topsoil is all that the Indigenous nations wanted to share with their treaty partners. They didn't want anything underneath 6 inches of topsoil to be altered. So they wanted just enough for their treaty partners to grow crops. And why they did this is because they wanted to consider, the impact 7 generations ahead. For example, you think about Alberta with the tar sands, right? That's because that part of the treaty, that part that honored land, the depth of a plow, it was breached. It was breached. And so what we have now in that space is nothing left for 7 generations ahead. There'll be nothing for them, right? And that's happening right across our country. There's different things happening that are impacting. And of course, we understand we need, fossil fuels to live. But I mean, the understanding for Indigenous community was that we wanted to leave everything unaltered. We didn't want those resources impacted, because we understood how it would impact the ecology, and we'd have nothing to preserve for 7 generations. And so that honoring the land was always first and foremost, because that's how, for thousands of years, Indigenous people had intertribal treaties that allowed that, that recognized that we had to always think about the impact we made today, the choices we made today, and how we treated the land, because how will that affect those future generations? The treaty relationship, is something that I think a lot of us are capable, or we're even living it every day, and we don't realize it. Because what it really is just principles that, allow us to treat each other with kindness and respect. And the easiest way, I feel, to understand the importance of the treaty relationship and to understand what it means to be a treaty person is understanding these 4 principles of treaty. And so they're in the Cree language. And so the first one that we want to always keep first and foremost, I mean, they're all 4 of them are important, but I'll put them in an order that helps you to understand, the connection to each other. Because the first one is Wokotuin, and that means we honor and respect relationships and kinships beyond the immediate family. It means kinship, family. So when treaty partners, come together, it's Wokotuin, we're now family. So that was the idea when these sacred agreements were taking place, was that Wokotuin was now happening. We're family, we're kinship together. all treaty partners, we have to respect and treat each other as we would our own family and kin. Because we should get along with others and respect others. We should live in harmony with everyone. We should always be going forward each day in a good way where we always treat our kinship, we always treat Wakotuin with honor and respect. Because we Taskwin, we all live together on the land. We all have an important responsibility to share this land and respect it and maintain it for future generations. And why we do this is Bimatsuin. We want to live a good life. We want a good life for ourselves and for our family. And we should live in a way where we're positive, we're respecting all of creation, we're respecting the land, respecting ourselves. And so that treaty relationship, right, is Wakotuin, kinship, Miowachituin, honoring and respecting each other, Witaskwin, sharing the land, because of Bimatsuin. We all want a good life. And so I always find that that's the easiest way, to understand the treaty relationship, to understand how being a good treaty person means honoring all your kin, treating everyone with respect, understanding you have to share the land, because of course we all deserve to have a good, prosperous life. Where I come from Beardy's and Okamasas Cree Nation, which is in Treaty 6 territory. What the area I grew up in is very interesting. There's a lot of history. It's where the Battle of Duck Lake started, and which led to the Battle of Batoche, and ultimately led to a lot of hardships for the Métis Nation, but also hardships for my community, because the government had stripped our chief of his title, although we still in the community recognized him as our chief, but they had stripped him of his title in 1885. And the community of Beardy's was not given the right to have a chief again until 1945. So the nation remained without leadership for all those years. And the reason why is because our leader was labeled, as a troublemaker and as a rebel, because of what was taking place on his traditional territory, where he was allowing, Métis community to gather and have meetings outside of, government watch. And so a battle took place on our community, which is the Battle of Duck Lake. And our leader, he was an entrepreneur. Before he negotiated and signed Treaty 6, he had set up a toll booth on either side of his land, so that anyone who wanted to access Fort Carlton would have to pass through his territory and pay a toll. So, he was not only a spiritual leader, but, he was an entrepreneur. And, was in our territories, one of the only chiefs that didn't actually sign right at Fort Carlton, negotiated at Fort Carlton, but signed at a different location. And that too, they labeled him as a troublemaker for that. But his reasoning was that he wanted to sign the treaty on a location that he chose, because he was a spiritual leader and a visionary. He was a medicine man. He had vision that he should sign treaty on his land, on his territory. But they met him kind of halfway and agreed to that spot. But that was already where the government kind of had labeled, our leader as somebody that was, I guess, not following the procedure as planned. And the other part about Beardy is that during Treaty 6 negotiations, often asked about the Métis people, often because Beardy had relatives who were Métis, and Beardy's sister was married into Métis community. So he always was, adamant that the Métis people deserve rights too, and they deserve a land base, and they deserve recognition, and had tried to get some of the Métis people in and around that area to be able to be included in the treaty. And, it's important to highlight that, because often there's this, between those communities, right, there's a barrier, right? Because of the idea that one had recognition and the other didn't, where they're both family. And that's, for example, in the community I come from, where it's a lot of Métis and First Nations people living in and amongst each other on the reserve and off the reserve. And so it was, government that made those division between those communities, and ultimately between nations. But the important thing though is like, despite, those parts of the relationship that, wear thin, and despite the fact that, parts of treaty were breached and things weren't fulfilled and honored, that we can go back and change things when we focus in on the positive parts, the parts of that treaty that were forgotten about, the parts of, sorry, I went too forward, the parts of that treaty that often get overlooked. And a big part of that is like the symbolism within the treaty medal. Each signatory chief would get a medal after, as sort of, a token of appreciation, but also to symbolize that relationship. And it often gets overlooked and just seen as, just the medal. But the important thing about the medal is that you have two individuals there. You have somebody representing, the Indigenous nations, you have somebody representing, the British Crown and the settler community. And they have their hands extended to each other and they're shaking hands. They don't have their hands up ready to fight. They're meeting each other halfway and extending their hands to each other. And I know that the handshake is often seen as, as an acknowledgement, as a recognition, as a sign of respect. But for Indigenous community, the handshake symbolized something more. And that's why it was so important to have that included on the medal. And this is a teaching that was shared with me from an elder from Soto community, and explained that when you extend your hand to shake somebody's hand and you offer your hand forward, your thumb is pointing upwards to acknowledge Creator and God. And then you're got a finger that's pointing across to the person in front of you, acknowledging them. So your pointer finger acknowledges that somebody is across from you. And then the rest of your three fingers identify that you are made up of mind, body, and spirit. And that all together, mind, body, spirit, Creator, and the person across, it all makes you stronger, so that when we come together, we're even stronger. And that was what the symbolism of the handshake was, because together in this treaty relationship, as treaty partners, we had to come together and help each other, help our nations to be stronger. And so that's important when you think about that symbolism of the treaty medal and the handshake, that it was much more than an acknowledgement. It was understanding that relationship that we have with each other, that we have to be reliant on each other and depend on each other and support each other, so that we can be stronger within our own nations, in our own families, our communities. Because we want that relationship, that treaty relationship, to continually grow. We want it to be something that we live by, because that's how we maintain things for future generations. That's how we are able to have something for 7 generations ahead. Because these treaties were not meant to be something that would ever go away. As long as we have a land base, we have treaty, because treaty is rooted in the land. And it was Chief Seesequasis during Treaty 6 negotiations at Fort Carlton that said that these treaties will last as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow. To state that these treaties would last forever. As long as the sun is here, as long as we have our water, as long as we have a land base, we will always have these treaties, these sacred agreements that ensured that these nations could maintain themselves. But unfortunately, when we talked about throughout the evening, you've heard me say breach of treaty, right? And the biggest breach of treaty was the creation of the Indian Act. And so there's always often a misconception that treaties and the Indian Act go together, that Indigenous people had involvement in the creation and development of the Indian Act, where it was something that was tactfully done to mislead and to subjugate a people. So while Treaty 6 was being negotiated in 1876, the Indian Act was being created. So all those things that we spoke about, the sacredness of treaty, the mutual benefit, that relationship of reciprocity, the continual fulfillment, that spirit and intent of treaty was all being contradicted in this Indian Act. So the idea where treaty partners would be, at the same level and no treaty partner would benefit over the other, this Indian Act didn't allow that. It allowed one treaty partner to suffer and another to prosper. And it's important that when we talk about treaties and the treaty relationship, that we have to focus on where that relationship started to wear away. What created that. And ultimately it's systemic racism that permeated social spaces and allowed for, the general society to not have any understanding or awareness that they were a treaty person, that they had roles and responsibilities, and that they had, a responsibility to maintain that treaty relationship amongst treaty partners. And so as I mentioned, it's not at all connected to any involvement with the Indigenous community. It's something that they had no advising on, no consulting with them. It was just ultimately forced upon them. And a lot of policies that came after the Indian Act were not even law, but because of the creation of the Indian Act, which allowed the creation of the Department of Indian Affairs and Indian agents, it was so easy for the government to then utilize laws and policies that would continually take away from the humanity of their Indigenous treaty partners, that would confine them and assimilate them, and ultimately lead to a lot of what often gets perceived as the social issues that we see within Indigenous community. But we have to understand that it comes from a long legacy of a breach of treaty and the impacts to Indigenous community, because in the treaty, the idea was that livelihood would remain as it had, undisrupted. The ability to access your inherent right to hunt and fish and gather, is now taken away from you. The ability to sing, in your traditional language and pray, have ceremony, all of that is, restricted under the Indian Act. Because Indigenous people wanted to maintain, right, as things had been, be able to still migrate, with the animals, the seasons. Unfortunately, excuse me, unfortunately, we're placed on the reserve system. And we had talked about that earlier, the size of the treaty territories of 1 to 11, and which shows you the size of the vastness of the territories of Indigenous people to be 2% now, of all that land base that was traditionally theirs, now on 2% of it. And that's over 650 tribes, individual Indigenous nations that are now only occupying 2% of the land base. They created the pass and the permit system, and there's an example of a pass on the screen here, where you had to have permission from the Indian agent to leave the reserve. So you would need a pass, say you want to leave the reserve to sell, an item. Maybe you want to sell a cow, maybe you want to sell some wood. You would need the Indian agent to give you a pass to leave the reserve for, set amount of time, on which date. And then you would need to get a permit from the Indian agent stating that you're going to sell these goods. And then often your buyer also needed a permit from the Indian agent saying that they were going to buy goods off you. It was all permission. You need permission to leave the reserve. You need permission to sell your goods, and your buyer needs permission. So ultimately, when you think about it, if somebody, wants to buy, some goods, they're not going to buy off an Indigenous person because there's too much, hoops to jump through. The buyer even has to get permission. So it really disadvantaged Indigenous people from even being involved in agriculture. And so even, the peasant farming policy, there was a cap placed on how much revenue you could generate from your crops. And there was even the fee to buy was implemented by the Indian agents and was always at least 2/3 less than what settler community was selling their goods for. So they were always finding ways to continually disadvantage their Indigenous treaty partner, find ways to continually make them reliant on government rations, and continually find ways to strip them of their humanity and their inherent rights that they had to access the land. In Treaty 4, they had asked for a school on each reserve, on each community. Wherever they settled, they wanted to be able to place a school there and have an instructor come. But they created the residential school era, which, operated right until 1996. So when you think about the Indian Act and the impact that it had and how it really contradicted all of those promises and agreements made during those sacred treaties, it created intergenerational traumas for Indigenous people. Yes, we know residential school, creates intergenerational traumas, but we have to look at the bigger picture. Where did residential schools come from? They came from the Indian Act. What is the Indian Act? It's a breach of treaty, and the Indian Act is still in existence today. It's still, a law in this country, and it still impacts a lot of Indigenous people to this day. You economically, culturally, health-wise, the impact is really astounding when you think about it, in terms of how you go from being able to live solely off the buffalo to now being completely reliant on foreign goods, right? There's so much that Indigenous people relied on with the buffalo, right? There was not one part of it that wasn't utilized, from tools and food, shelter, to suddenly having, no buffalo. The buffalo were hunted by the millions, often just hunted solely for the hide. And it was a textile that they had never seen before, settler community, right? So what was happening is the buffalo was being shipped, overseas, the hides, by the millions. And if you look at like history in Europe in the Industrial Revolution, the timing is at the exact same time as when the buffalo were leaving the prairies in the late 1870s and early 1880s. It's, right at the same time that their Indigenous people have, lost their access to their livelihood and to their this very spiritual animal that provides for all of their livelihood. Now we have the start of the Industrial Revolution and basically the creation of the fashion industry, all because of these textiles here in the prairies that had never been seen before and were being mass hunted. But it was really impacting the livelihood of the people that were here and the livelihood that was supposed to be protected in these sacred agreements, in our treaty negotiations. But unfortunately, the Indian Act really put us in a position where everything that we had hoped would not happen did, which was that culture loss, that loss of a sovereign nation, that the loss of our traditional leadership, where, historically leadership was hereditary or it was inherited, appointed, where we were given the election system through the Indian Act. also the leadership, and like that came from also, as I mentioned, our grandmother societies. During those treaty negotiations, government officials were really, aware of what was taking place, that these male leaders were coming and advising with them all day, and then going back to the grandmother societies, and the grandmothers were the ones telling them what to bring to the government officials. So for a patriarchal society, it was really difficult for them to see that Indigenous people were very matriarchal, and that women were held in the highest regard and were first and foremost the leaders. And so because they had been watching this, right, through, all the negotiations and the interactions that they were having, that's why it was very tactful for them in the Indian Act to change membership. So historically, an Indigenous man, he would leave his tribe and move to his wife's tribe, and he would stay there. Because a woman, she stayed in her tribe right from birth till death. And so as she aged and became elderly, she then joined the grandmother society because she'd been a part of that tribe her entire life. So she'd seen everything that had impacted that tribe, and she knew what was best, deciding what happens to the tribe. So that is why women, they stayed in their tribe right from birth till death, and they moved on to become the highest level of government in their community, advising all of leadership, advising the chiefs and the headmen. So what took place in the Indian Act is that they created that when a woman married a man from another tribe, she must leave her tribe and go to his community and may no longer be affiliated with her tribe. And it wasn't until Bill C-31 in 1982 that 1985, that women were then able to gain back their traditional membership to the communities that they were no longer allowed to be recognized with. So they'd been doing this since 1876. So ultimately what happened was the dismantling of grandmother societies. And there are no grandmother societies in any of our nations anymore. It's something that we've been talking about reintroducing. I've been talking to leadership in my community in Beardies and working together to, how do we bring back our grandmother societies for those women that live in the tribe, live within the community right from birth. They should be the ones we advise on the best practices, because historically that's what we did. So you can see the impact that the Indian Act really had to the communities, to the governance structures, to the laws, to sovereignty, right? Even the loss of traditional names, giving people, English names. Like, for example, my last name, Seesequasis. It comes from my ancestor. He had a son, his name was Seesequau, which is rattlesnake, and his son was Seesequasis, which was little rattlesnake. But, through the introduction of Indian agents and residential schools, my ancestor was given the name John, and Seesequasis, which was his first name, was then spelt in an English way and turned into his last name, which is what I have now, Seesequasis. And so a lot of Indigenous people, their surnames actually come from an ancestor who's had that as their first name, and then were given an English name, a church name, and then use their actual traditional name as a surname. So you'll see that a lot of people are slowly reclaiming the traditional spelling of it as well. That's what I use in my consulting, which is Seesequau Isquau, which is rattlesnake woman. Is returning to those traditional spelling and use of those names, because it was the Indian Act that stripped that, right? You think about how discriminatory it was to be denying ceremony, to be denying inherent right to hunting and to gathering medicines. It's difficult, and when you think about that, you can then understand, a lot of, the hardships and, the contemporary issues that, society loves to, always put in the first and in the forefront. We aren't hearing things in the media where, for example, in 2023, in Canada, they had the highest rate of Indigenous high school graduates in history. And at the same time, in 2023, we had the highest rate of Indigenous people registered in post-secondary institutions. What we often look at is, these parts of society, of history, and how it's impacted us. We think about it, we see it, we know, okay, we've got high levels of incarceration, we've got gang violence, we have addictions, but nobody ever thinks about, well, the history, how did we get to that place? It's that breach of the Indian Act that got us to that place, because the Indian Act, of course, confined, placed children, in residential schools from, for some of them from the age of 4 till 15, and, denied them access to their culture, their community, to family, to love. Then once they're able to leave the residential school, they go back home to the reserve and they're confined there again, and they need permission to leave. They can't practice their culture. It's banned even back home. So you think about that, over 160 years of this happening, and then this is the result, right? Is the intergenerational trauma. And I feel it's important that we understand that all of these come from that breach of treaty. There's Indigenous people have very high levels of diabetes in their communities. It's really unfortunate, and why that is happening is because of that breach of treaty. We were not allowed to access our inherent right to hunt and gather. We were denied that for generations, and ingesting things that were foreign to us. A lot of sugar, which we didn't have in our diet, or wheat. And what it's created now in contemporary times is, a lot of diabetes and heart issues within Indigenous community. And that's all directly related to the Indian Act and the breach of treaty. And so, even within communities, low economic development, that's because of the Indian Act. It's not because Indigenous community don't want to be prosperous and create revenue and infrastructure. The Indian Act has certain, laws in place that do not allow you to, own a business on reserve. You can't own a house. You can't get a bank loan for a business. There's a lot of things in the Indian Act that really prohibit Indigenous people from advancing. And it's all meant to keep them confined to the reserve, reliant on the government, and living at the very lowest level, right? Basically, as just surviving, not prospering. And it's unfortunate because when those agreements were taking place, when ceremony was being brought to that space, the hope was that things like this could be prevented by honoring each other and respecting each other, and having that mutual benefit. And, one of the unfortunate things too is that, when Indigenous communities will receive funding annually from Indigenous Services Canada, and it often gets seen as taxpayers' dollars. There's a lot of, misinformation where, people will say, oh, and in a racist and discriminatory way, that, their taxpayers' dollars are paying for First Nations education, healthcare, the infrastructure and maintenance of our reserve communities, but that's really false. And the money that provides to Indigenous community comes from the Indian Trust Fund, which has been generating, royalties and revenues from natural resources since 1858. And so what happens is that the money that we are given comes, from this fund. It doesn't come from any of the taxpayers' dollars. But the idea why um, I think that that's coming into place is because the Indian Trust Fund used to be its own separate entity, but it's now been amalgamated with kind of like the general account for, you know, taxation and revenue within Canada. So it's been consolidated into one account where historically it was just, the Indian Trust Fund, and then they had, Canada had their fund from taxation, but then they've pooled them together. And this is where that idea comes that, oh, well, it's taxpayers' dollars. But really what's happening is it's that sale of crown land, the leasing of crown land, the royalties that come from the resources that are extracted, and the revenue. All of that money goes into that Indian Trust Fund. And that is what, provides for Indigenous communities. But the thing is that it's in the trillions and we get crumbs. We don't even have, some of our nations don't have drinking water. You think about like the the impact that that breach of treaty has had. It's really let one treaty partner advance over the other. And that was what was to be avoided. That was what we were trying to move away from. We wanted to be able to have that mutual benefit, that mutual existence, a reciprocal relationship where we respect each other and make sure that not one of us is benefiting more than the other. But the Indian Act, has allowed for, that ability to have a treaty partner that's, left behind. But I know that, despite those treaty breaches, which are very impactful and they're hurtful, and there's generations of healing that Indigenous nation community and families have to do. The important thing is that, Indigenous community have had that opportunity to be able to reclaim their identity. Indigenous communities are having more opportunity to assert their sovereignty. And we have more spaces like this space that we're sharing together right now. We have more opportunities like this to come together and talk about our history, our shared history that we have, whether we identify as First Nations, Métis, settler, newcomer, this is our history that we all share. We all had ancestors that were a part of, these early agreements, negotiations, relationships. And so it's important that we have conversations like this about that we talk about that relationship that should have been, and how do we move forward and make sure that that relationship is fostered and developed, and that we promote, that treaty relationship as much as we can in our personal lives, our home lives, our work lives, and that we recognize that we are a treaty person and we have a role and a responsibility aligned with that. We have to understand that there are inherent laws, laws that ensure that the land maintains, that we have, something for future generations, that 7 generations ahead, they have a land base to make a life for themselves. Now that we understand, inherent rights, we have rights to live off the land, but we have a responsibility to keep that land base safe. Understanding that spirit and intent of treaty, understanding like the sacredness of it, right? Those songs and prayers and ceremonies that were brought into that space with the best of intention to ensure that 2 nations and their people could move forward in a really good way together. Understanding that symbol of treaty with the handshake extended, that, we are, not just one person. We are made up of mind, body, and spirit. The creator is always present with us, and that we need each other, to be stronger. And remembering those principles of treaty, those 4 principles that we talked about that help us to understand that we're kin with each other. We got to respect each other, share the land, because we all want to have a good life together. And it's important that we when we think about our treaty identity and, you know, that relationship, that we always think 7 generations ahead. You know, what are we leaving for the future generations, right? You know, whatever it is that we do, I always tell people, consider, you know, what is a sustainable practice? You know, we need to be thinking in a bigger picture, because we see that we're in a place where there's a climate crisis globally, um, you know, and we have to consider, you know, how do we be a good ancestor, right? You know, how the future generations, what will they say about us? What did we leave for them? You know, were we good treaty partners to each other? Did we honor the treaty relationship the way we were supposed to? You know, that's what we want to think about, right? Because we want to always be promoting that treaty relationship. We want to recognize, you know, whatever your cultural identity is, you know, I think it's important too, because that's what, when the treaties were negotiated, we were supposed to maintain our livelihoods as they had been. And, you know, I often tell settler community that what was your cultural, your ancestors' cultural identity when they came? Because many of our settler community, they also had to assimilate into British ideologies here in Canada. And that often gets overlooked too. We have community, for example, you know, I've been doing some work with Ukrainian community, you know, we have to understand that a lot of our Ukrainian community came here and had to hide their identity and conform to British ideologies. That in that breach of treaty, not only did we assimilate our Indigenous treaty partners, we also assimilated our own, you know, British Crown and the treaty partners that came through that relationship, because that treaty was created with the British Crown, right? So there was an assimilation happening on both sides because we weren't honoring that relationship, right? We weren't understanding how we had to treat each other in a good way based on those treaty principles, right? We had to remember Wakutuan. We are kinship, we're family now. Miowachituan, we need to honor and respect those relationships we have with our kinship and our family. Because with Tascoan, we're all living together on this land. We got to share this land in a good way with each other because of Pimatsuan. We have to live a good life. You know, we all want to live a good life with each other, a good life with creation, a good life with the land. And so those treaty principles, you know, are what will guide us in making that relationship stronger. And the treaty principles are what will help us to understand that this treaty identity has a role and a responsibility. And so when we think about, you know, that spirit and intent, right, you know, mutual benefit and respect, you know, peaceful coexistence, continual fulfillment, you know, a relationship of reciprocity and mutual benefit, you know, that's what the spirit and intent was about. And when we focus on that understanding of the treaty principles and apply that to that treaty relationship, then it will naturally allow that spirit and intent to unfold. And just like what that quote I shared with you earlier from late Elder Danny Musqueam, where he says, nothing really dies out in a circle. Things might get old and wear away, but they renew again, generation after generation. This is what the circle is about. So I feel that, you know, although that relationship was wearing away and was almost non-existent for generations, we're in a time and a place where it's starting to get stronger again, where that relationship is starting to renew itself again, because we have these spaces where we can talk about this, you know, where we have spaces where inherent rights are being honored and recognized, you know, and the easiest way to make change is with the people. You know, it's at the grassroots level. We often think that we need to, you know, rely on our government systems to make that change for us, but it's the people who make the change. And within the province of Saskatchewan, which has now expanded into Treaty 6 territory in Alberta, is a network that explains the exact idea of the change that people can make at the grassroots level. I'm one of the founding members of the Treaty Land Sharing Network, which is a network that's aimed at providing safe spaces for Indigenous people to access their inherent right to hunting, fishing, gathering for medicinal purposes or food or ceremony. And so what we've done is we've been able to, within Treaty 6 and Treaty 4, we have 54 sections of land available on our network. You can visit our website, treatylandsharingnetwork.ca, and settler community, is who holds title to that land. And through the work that we've been doing since 2020, we've been able to have safe spaces. We partnered with some wonderful individuals in the province of Alberta from various organizations. And we created an Alberta chapter, which is only in Treaty 6 right now, but we hope to expand. We have our official launch on July 6th in Camrose. So I'll share that information with Helping Hands, and they can pass that along to any of you individuals that are here this evening. But it's an example of what can happen when you just share this information that I shared with you. And it started as having several, evening webinars like this, and inviting settler community to come and listen to what we had to say. And eventually grew into a network that is now, providing safe spaces. And I present often alongside individuals who, hold title to land and have the land in our network. And they come and share the process of how they went from being, somebody who had no understanding or idea of, a treaty identity and who had never talked to an Indigenous person before, to now opening up their land and letting Indigenous people access it, for their inherent rights. And it was the people, community people, just, individuals that knew we needed a better way moving forward that created that change. And, it all starts with just opportunities like this evening, to listen to, an Indigenous person, share their perspective of the territories that we live in. That's how we can start to make that change. And, by being open and receptive to other ways of knowing, and to always, do something with what if whether you share it with somebody, a colleague, a friend, a family member, maybe you make a post on social media, but continue to share what you learn and continue to create conversations where we become more enlightened and aware of who we are as treaty people and what it means to live within the territories that we do live in. As Laura had started off the evening with that beautiful land acknowledgement, that's a start. Acknowledging where it is that you live and finding a personal approach to understanding the territory as a treaty territory, but the territory as it belongs to an Indigenous nation. And so, as Elder Danny said, things, they may wear away, but they renew again. And I think that's what's happening currently in our society, is that things are renewing again. The treaty relationship is starting to, reignite. And, it took over 160 years to get to this place. And so it might take just as long for us to get to a place that our ancestors had intended, but we all should continue to, because we want to be good ancestors, right? We want to remember to think about what we leave for 7 generations, and how are we going to promote that relationship, going forward. And so there's this quote on Matrix Chief in Battle River, and it says, "We all know the story about the man who sat by the trail too long, and then it grew over, and he could never find his way again. We can never forget what has happened, but we cannot go back, nor can we just sit beside the trail." So while we can't change what happened, we can't change that breach of treaty and the impact it had to our Indigenous treaty partners and the intergenerational trauma that it's created, we can't go back and fix that. But what we can do is try better, to be better treaty partners to each other, to try not to let what happened in the past repeat itself, and to move forward in a good way every day, understanding, wakotuin, miowachituin, witaskuin, bimatsuin. Remember, we're kin. We should honor and respect each other always because we share the land here and we all deserve to have a good life. So with this information, don't let the trail go over. Take this information and let it propel you into a different space where you are now proud to be a treaty person and you know your role and responsibility and you know that it is important to promote that treaty relationship in all that you do. So with that, thank you so much for being, wonderful guests and wonderful hosts, the Helping Hands. Um, thank you for letting me share knowledge about the treaties and the treaty relationship. It's always an honor for me to come into this space. The knowledge that I share doesn't belong to me, it belongs to all of us. And the knowledge that I share has been graciously shared with me by many knowledge keepers and elders. And what I do is just carry on the good work of them and make sure that, we're all aware of that idea that the treaty relationship is something that can guide us in our life in a good way. And so thank you to you all. Please do look up the Treaty Land Sharing Network. I'll send information to Helping Hands regarding that launch in Alberta. So if you're in and around the area, maybe you can register and come. It's a free event. And yeah, my contact information is up there. Should you ever want to reach out. I am an independent consultant and I speak on several topics, not just treaties, but anything related to Indigenous history, Indigenous culture, Indigenous ways of knowing, reconciliation. So yeah, but I'll turn it over to Helping Hands and thank you to you all for hosting me this evening. It's been a wonderful time sharing with you all.